The first thing that hit Mallory wasn't the sight. It was the smell. Damp wood, stale air, and something metallic that clung to the back of her throat. She had been on dozens of welfare checks as a volunteer with the missing children's group, but this one felt different before she even stepped through the door. The hallway was dim, the blinds drawn tight even though it was mid-afternoon. Somewhere deep inside, she heard it, a sound so faint she almost thought she imagined it. A humming, slow, rhythmic, and heartbreakingly out of tune. She moved toward the noise, her shoes creaking on the warped floorboards. The officer with her hung back, distracted by a call crackling through his radio. Back bedroom, Mallory whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was whispering at all. Her hand hesitated on the tarnished brass doorknob. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was thick enough to make her pulse pound in her ears. She pushed the door open. The room was nearly empty, except for the cage. It sat in the corner like a relic from another era, its rusted bars flaking onto the floor. Inside, curled up with knees to his chest, was a boy. His hair hung in uneven strands around his face, and his skin looked too pale, almost translucent, like he hadn't seen sunlight in months. In his arms, a teddy bear with one ear hanging by a thread. His eyes flicked up at her, but he didn't speak. Mallory knelt to his level. "Hey," she said softly, forcing a smile she didn't feel. No reaction, only a slight tightening of his grip on the bear. She asked his name, but the only answer was a faint rocking motion forward and back. That's when she saw the papers scattered on the floor of the cage, torn scraps, each covered in drawings. Most were just shapes and lines, but one made her pause. It was a picture of a bright yellow sun in the corner, but next to it was another sun, this one black, with jagged edges. Between them stood a small figure, head bowed. Mallory felt a cold prickle at the back of her neck. "What's this?" she asked, pointing gently. The boy looked at the drawing for a moment, then back at her. His lips moved, but no sound came. She realized, with a jolt, that this boy hadn't spoken in a long, long time. The officer stepped into the room, finally noticing the cage. "Jesus, what the hell?" He cut himself off, probably realizing the child could hear him. Mallory stood, her voice sharper now. "We need to get him out of here." But as she reached for the latch, the boy's eyes widened in sudden panic. He shook his head, clinging to the teddy bear like it was the only thing holding him to this world. Why would he be afraid of being freed? They coaxed him gently, but the boy wouldn't move. His gaze darted toward the doorway behind them. Mallory turned just in time to see a shadow fall across the hall. A man stood there, tall and broad, his face obscured in the dim light. He didn't speak, just stared, his presence heavy and unyielding. Mallory felt an instinctive tightening in her gut. Something about him made her want to put her own body between him and the boy. The officer straightened, his tone suddenly professional. "Sir, are you the guardian of this child?" The man didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer, and Mallory caught the faintest whiff of alcohol on his breath. His eyes slid past her, locking on the boy in the cage. The humming started again, louder now, urgent, almost like a warning. "He doesn't talk," the man finally said, his voice low. "Hasn't since, you know." He didn't elaborate. Mallory's mind spun. Since what? She looked at the boy, who had stopped rocking and was now staring at the floor. His teddy bear's head rested against the bars. On its fur, she noticed tiny flecks of something dark, dry blood. She crouched again, ignoring the man's presence behind her. "You're safe," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Not yet. The officer began asking the man for identification, and Mallory used the distraction to slide one of the boy's drawings into her coat pocket. She didn't know why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the feeling that these drawings were more than just pictures. As she straightened, the boy reached through the bars and lightly touched her wrist. His fingers were ice cold. He pointed, not at her, not at the door, but toward the far side of the cage. There, half hidden under a thin blanket, was a second teddy bear. This one was missing entirely. Only the flattened, worn body remained, its stuffing spilling out. Something small and hard glinted inside the torn seam. Mallory's hand hovered over it, but before she could investigate, the man's voice cut through the air like a blade. "I think you've seen enough." Her eyes locked with the boy's one last time before she stood. There was something in them, not just fear, but a silent plea. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew one thing for certain. Leaving this house without answers wasn't an option. As they stepped out into the hallway, the officer murmured that CPS would handle it. Mallory nodded automatically, but her chest felt tight. She had been in this line of work long enough to know what handle it often meant. Paperwork, delays, and too many cracks for children to slip through. The humming had stopped entirely now, replaced by an unnatural quiet. She glanced back at the room, at the bars, at the boy's pale face half hidden in shadow. Then she noticed something she hadn't before. One of the drawings pinned to the wall outside the cage. It showed two boys standing side by side. One looked like Ethan. The other was a stranger. And in bold red crayon, across the bottom, a single word, Lucas. Mallory's pulse quickened. Who was Lucas? And why did she have the sinking feeling that finding him would answer more questions than she was ready to face? Please subscribe this channel and leave your thoughts. The smell of stale air clung to Mallory's hair as she stepped out of the room, Timothy's watchful eyes trailing her every move. She could feel his presence like a weight pressing between her shoulder blades. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The only sound was the faint hum of a refrigerator somewhere deeper in the house, and the soft, muffled thump of Ethan's teddy bear hitting the cage floor behind her. In the kitchen, a single bulb flickered above the chip counter. Mallory's gaze was drawn to the corner. A dusty, barely functional laptop sat half open, its screen asleep. The temptation to lift the lid was overwhelming. Her gut told her that answers lived in there, and maybe even proof. But Timothy's heavy footsteps entered the room, and the moment evaporated like breath on glass. The next morning, Mallory sat in her car across the street. She could see the second-floor window, the one with the blinds always pulled tight. Her thermos coffee had gone cold. She had been there for almost an hour, waiting for Timothy to leave. When he finally did, his rusted pickup truck groaning down the road, she moved quickly. Inside, the house was even quieter than before. She could hear the creak of her own shoes. Ethan was in the cage again, rocking ever so slightly, his teddy bear pressed under his chin. His eyes flicked to her, then to the laptop on the counter. It wasn't just a glance. It was a signal. She lifted the lid, the screen humming awake. The inbox was open, hundreds of unread emails, but one sat marked as draft. It was dated nearly 8 months ago, the subject line, *urgent, child at risk. Her pulse hammered as she clicked. The email was addressed to the County Child Protective Services office. It detailed bruises, prolonged absences from school, and Ethan's increasing fear of Timothy. It was signed by Susan, the woman Mallory only knew as Timothy's late wife. But at the very bottom, the words stopped mid-sentence, as if someone had been interrupted while typing. The send button had never been pressed. Before Mallory could process the weight of what she'd just read, a faint sound came from the hallway. She spun toward it, but it wasn't Timothy. It was a woman, pale, thin, with streaks of gray in her once dark hair. Her hands shook as she clutched the doorframe. "I didn't send it," Susan said softly, her voice raw like gravel. "I wanted to, but I didn't." Mallory stared at her, realizing with a shock that Susan was not dead. She was living here, hidden, almost spectral, in a house where every wall felt like it had been listening. Susan's eyes darted toward the cage room. "He hears everything," she whispered, "even when he's not here." Before Mallory could speak, footsteps thudded against the porch outside. Susan's hand trembled as she reached for Mallory's wrist. "You can't take him yet," she said. "You don't know what you'll be taking him from." Timothy's voice called from outside, closer now. Mallory's eyes flicked to Ethan's window. The blinds had shifted, just slightly. A pale face was peeking out. Not Ethan's. It was another boy. Older. Darker hair. Eyes full of something between rage and resignation. Mallory's breath caught. The drawing in Ethan's cage, the boy in the green shirt, the one labeled Lucas, was real. And he was still here. The night smelled of damp wood and stale air inside Timothy's house, and Mallory felt the weight of it pressing against her chest as she stepped inside uninvited. She had timed it perfectly. Timothy had gone to the night shift at the mill. Susan was likely locked away in her bedroom, and the only sounds came from the slow ticking of a wall clock and the faint humming she had heard before, the sound that had kept her awake for nights. She followed it now, her boots silent against the old linoleum, until she reached the back of the house. There, hidden by a tall shelving unit and stacks of boxes, was the cage. Her breath caught in her throat, not just from the sight of the thin boy inside, but from the smell of rust and unwashed clothes. Ethan sat cross-legged, his pale knees drawn up to his chest, his teddy bear clutched tightly. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her to the faint outline of the back door, as if measuring the distance. For a second, Mallory thought he might speak, but instead, he tilted his head slightly, eyes flicking to the teddy bear's patched ear, then to her shoes. It was a signal, she realized, a silent language born of survival. Before she could move closer, a creak from upstairs made her freeze. She turned to find Susan standing halfway down the staircase, wrapped in her oversized cardigan like a shield. The woman's eyes were wide, but not in surprise, in recognition. She knew Mallory had been here before. They stared at each other for a long moment. The silence between them weighted with everything neither dared say. Mallory broke it first, whispering, "Why haven't you done anything?" Susan's lips trembled as she looked at Ethan, then back to her. "You think I haven't tried?" she said, her voice cracking. "You don't know what he's capable of." Her gaze darted toward the front door, as if Timothy might walk in any moment. She stepped forward, and for the first time, Mallory saw the thin scar running along Susan's jawline, half hidden by her hair. "There's an email," Susan whispered, "on his laptop. It can end all of this. What if I send it?" She didn't finish. Instead, she turned and retreated up the stairs, her cardigan trailing like a ghost shadow. Mallory's heart pounded. The unopened email. She knew she couldn't waste time. Kneeling beside the cage, she whispered to Ethan, "I'm going to help you." The boy blinked, but his body stayed perfectly still, as if movement itself was dangerous. She reached through the bars, her fingertips brushing his small hand. It was cold, almost too cold. "Tonight," she whispered, "I'll be back." But before she could pull away, Ethan leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers for the first time. His lips didn't move, but she thought she heard something faint, like air escaping. It wasn't a word she could understand, but it was enough to shake her to the core. Back in her car, Mallory replayed the sound in her mind as she sat gripping the steering wheel. It was only when she glanced at the rearview mirror that she noticed movement. Someone at the upstairs window. Lucas, his face half hidden by the blinds, eyes unblinking, his expression a mixture of warning and desperation. Before she could process what it meant, the blinds snapped shut. She didn't know yet if Lucas was a threat, an ally, or just another prisoner of this house. But she knew one thing. Whatever she had stumbled into was bigger than she'd imagined. When Timothy returned later that night, Susan was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup that smelled of nothing. No spices, no life. He hung his coat slowly, his boots leaving wet marks on the floor, and for a moment, the house was filled only with the sound of dripping water. Then, his voice broke the silence. "I saw your car wasn't in the driveway earlier," he said, without looking at her. "Where were you?" Susan's hands tightened around the wooden spoon until her knuckles turned white. "I went to the store," she replied. Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes stayed locked on the soup, as if daring him to doubt her. Timothy stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the counter. "Good," he said finally, his tone flat. "Because you know what happens when people start poking around." He turned and walked toward the back of the house, and Susan felt her breath leave her chest in shaky fragments. Upstairs, behind a locked door, Lucas listened to the sound of his father's footsteps, counting them like a clock ticking down. That night, Mallory couldn't sleep. She sat in her own dimly lit kitchen, the laptop open in front of her. She searched records, newspaper clippings, school attendance reports, anything that could tell her more about Ethan. And then she found it. 3 consecutive months of absences marked parent excused. No follow-up from school. No home visit from CPS. She felt her jaw clench. They had all seen it, the signs, and done nothing. Her phone buzzed suddenly, making her jump. A text from an unknown number read, "Don't come back. You don't know what you're walking into." The message was followed by an image, grainy, but clear enough for her to recognize Ethan's cage in the background. In the foreground was the teddy bear, its patched ear torn open, stuffing spilling out like a wound. She gripped the phone so hard her fingers hurt, but instead of fear, she felt the same fire that had driven her here in the first place. If they were warning her away, it meant she was getting close. And if she was close, then the only way forward was in. She didn't see the car idling half a block down, headlights off, the figure inside watching her kitchen window. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days, turning the dirt road to Timothy's house into a brown river of sludge. Mallory parked 2 streets away, unwilling to risk him seeing her car so close again. She walked the last stretch under the cover of dripping trees, heart pounding with every step, rehearsing what she'd say to Susan if she got the chance. The sound of a dog barking somewhere nearby seemed to follow her, as though warning her she didn't belong here. But she kept walking, her mind fixed on Ethan's hollow eyes in the cage. She told herself she was ready, yet every drop of water sliding down the back of her neck made her wonder if she really was. Inside the house, Susan moved like a shadow, her slippers barely making a sound on the warped floorboards. She'd learned to time her movements with Timothy's routines. When he was in the shower, she could breathe. When he was on the phone, she could think. Now, with him gone to the hardware store, she dared to open the hallway closet and pull out the hidden box where she kept her private notes. Inside were photographs of bruises, sketches of Ethan's cage, and a small USB stick containing a recording of him crying in the middle of the night. Her fingers trembled as she held it. Every time she looked at the evidence, it was like holding a match over gasoline. Dangerous, combustible, and impossible to forget. Ethan sat cross-legged in the cage, the teddy bear clutched to his chest, rocking back and forth with a rhythm that had become his own language. His head tilted slightly when he heard Susan's footsteps approach, though his eyes didn't meet hers. She slid a piece of paper between the bars, a simple drawing of a sun, the same one he always made. This time, there were 2 suns, one larger, one smaller side by side in the sky. She wanted to ask him what it meant, but her voice felt caught in her throat, as though speaking might shatter what little trust they had. Instead, she slipped him a folded cracker and stepped back quickly, afraid of the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Mallory watched from across the street, partially hidden behind the hood of her car. She could see the faint glow from the living room window, and in it, Timothy's shadow moving like a storm cloud. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from an unknown number. Asterisk stop. You don't know what you're dealing with. Asterisk the timing was perfect enough to feel intentional, as if someone inside the house could see her. She scanned the windows again, her eyes catching the faintest flicker of movement upstairs. For just a moment, she thought she saw Lucas, his pale face staring at her, but then the curtains fell back into place, and the house seemed to swallow him whole. That night, as wind howled through the cracked siding, Susan sat at the kitchen table long after Timothy had gone to bed. She stared at the unopened email still saved in her drafts folder, the one addressed to Child Protective Services. Her mouse hovered over the send button until her hand began to cramp, but still, she didn't click it. From upstairs, a floorboard creaked, and she froze listening. She knew the sound wasn't Timothy's heavy step. It was lighter, slower, almost deliberate. When she finally looked toward the staircase, she saw a figure half hidden in shadow. Lucas stood there, eyes wide, finger pressed to his lips, not in a gesture to keep quiet, but as if warning her about something far worse. The night was suffocatingly still, the kind of stillness that makes every creak of the floor sound like a scream in an empty hall. Mallory sat in her car outside the old house. Engine off, headlights dimmed, the weight of weeks pressing down on her shoulders. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, her eyes fixed on the faint orange glow from a window upstairs, Ethan's prison. Every instinct screamed for her to call the police, but she knew the system had already failed him once, maybe twice. This wasn't going to be a rescue on paper. This was going to be something else entirely. And yet, she hesitated because crossing that threshold meant she could never go back to the safe life she'd known. Inside, Susan sat on the couch, trembling fingers wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, though she hadn't taken a sip in hours. Timothy paced the living room, a wolf in human skin, muttering under his breath about ungrateful brats and meddling strangers. His shadow stretched across the walls like claws raking the peeling paint. Upstairs, the sound of muffled humming floated down. Ethan's coping song, a fragile thread of innocence weaving through the tension. Susan closed her eyes, the sound stabbing at the part of her heart she had spent years trying to bury. She knew tonight something was going to snap, and she prayed it wouldn't be the boy. Lucas was the first to hear the whisper of footsteps outside. He was sitting on the floor at the top of the stairs, knees drawn to his chest, when he caught sight of a shadow moving along the porch. He didn't need to see her face to know it was Mallory. His breath quickened. This was either salvation or the final nail in the coffin. He crawled toward Ethan's door, pressing his lips to the rusted metal bars. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, his voice shaking. Ethan's big blue eyes blinked in the gloom, the teddy bear clutched tighter. From somewhere deep inside the house, the sound of Timothy's voice grew louder, sharper. Mallory slipped through the back door, the hinges screaming in protest, but she moved like a ghost, her flashlight beam slicing through the dark. The air inside smelled of mildew, dust, and something metallic like old blood. Her eyes darted across the hallway until she saw it. A door with 3 locks and a strip of light at the bottom. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a thin crowbar she had borrowed from a friend. But before she could pry the first lock, a voice cut through the silence. Looking for something? Timothy's silhouette filled the hallway, broad shoulders blocking her only escape. His eyes glinted in the dim light, not with fear, but with amusement. Susan's mug shattered on the floor as she ran to the hallway, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. Timothy turned his head toward her, smiling that same cold smile he'd worn the night they buried Ethan's mother. "Our guest wants to see the boy," he said slowly, like each word was meant to savor her fear. Mallory didn't move, didn't breathe, but her eyes flicked to Susan, a silent plea passing between them. For a second, something in Susan's expression shifted, fear giving way to the faintest spark of defiance. But Timothy saw it too, and the moment was gone. Lucas made his move before he could think twice. He flew down the stairs, grabbing the crowbar from Mallory's hands and jamming it into the first lock. Timothy roared, lunging toward him, but Susan stepped into his path, shoving him with every ounce of strength she had left. The hallway erupted in chaos, shouting, metal scraping, the thud of heavy boots. Ethan's humming stopped. The second lock snapped free. The third was almost there. And then silence, a silence so deep it was almost deafening. The kind of silence that comes before something irreversible. The hallway seemed to shrink as Timothy roared, his voice ricocheting off the peeling walls, a sound so deep it rattled the air. Susan's trembling hands pressed harder against his chest, her frail body, somehow, finding the strength to keep him back. Lucas's knuckles were white as he forced the crowbar deeper into the first lock, the screech of metal against metal almost drowning out Ethan's soft whimper from inside. Mallory's heart pounded in her ears, too loud, too fast. Yet she held the flashlight steady, beam fixed on the lock like it was the only thing tethering them to hope. Timothy shoved Susan aside with a single violent thrust, sending her stumbling into the wall. Her head hit with a dull thud, and a pained gasp escaped her lips, but she stayed conscious, eyes locking on Ethan's shadow behind the bars. "Don't stop," she croaked to Lucas, voice barely audible over Timothy's heavy footsteps. Lucas's jaw clenched, sweat dripping down his temple, the crowbar groaning as the lock finally snapped with a sharp, satisfying crack. One down, 2 more to go. Timothy lunged, but Mallory stepped between them, her hands shaking yet holding firm against his chest. His breath reeked of stale beer, his eyes burning with a rage that felt centuries old. He shoved forward again, but Susan had risen, arms wrapping around his torso from behind in a desperate bear hug. Timothy's roar shook the air, but Lucas twisted the second lock free. Another scream of tortured metal, and Ethan's small hand pushed further through the bars, fingers stretching toward the light. "Just one more," Mallory shouted, though her voice was raw, half from fear, half from the urgency of it all. Timothy thrashed, nearly throwing Susan off, but she held on like her life depended on it. And maybe it did. Lucas jammed the crowbar into the final lock, his breaths ragged, teeth gritted, while Ethan's muffled humming, soft, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby, echoed eerily in the chaos. The last lock snapped. The sound was so sharp, so final, it felt like the world had paused. Mallory yanked the door open, the stale, heavy air of the cage rushing out, carrying with it years of silence. Ethan's wide eyes blinked at the sudden light, clutching his teddy bear so tight it seemed strained. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Timothy's glare, Mallory's trembling hands, Lucas's tear-streaked face, Susan's blood-matted hair, all frozen in a tableau of fear and defiance. Then Timothy broke free of Susan's grip, charging forward, and Mallory knew they had only seconds before this fragile victory would be crushed. She grabbed Ethan, pulling him in her arms, the boy's thin frame so light it felt like carrying a shadow. Behind her, Timothy's footsteps thundered closer, and somewhere deep inside the house, a door slammed open. Help, or another threat. They wouldn't know until it was too late. Please subscribe to this channel for more amazing videos.